which is to welcome you all to the CRDCN CJE joint webinar. This is, I believe, the sixth one in the series, or maybe the fourth. It's been a number anyways. If you're looking for previous iterations, they are available on our YouTube channel. I'll open us up with a quick land acknowledgement, which is that McMaster University, as host institution for the Canadian Research Data Center Network, is located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Begin our session today by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations and recognizing our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous people have to this land. You can visit Native Land Digital, a space where people can learn more about the lands they inhabit, the history of those lands, and how to actively be part of a better future going forward together. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Steven Lehrer, who is the editor for the Canadian Journal of Economics and is co-hosting with us today. Steven has not been editor very long. This is his first CRDCN CJE webinar together. But I'll turn it over to him now to sort of introduce himself and pass it on to our first speaker. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Grant. So I'm delighted to be here. So as Grant has mentioned, my name is Steven Lehrer. I'm a full professor at Queen's University, as well as the current editor-in-chief at Canadian Journal of Economics. And I'm really proud that Grant has done this because not only is it a chance to publish some of the excellent research in that uses data in the CRDCN, but also some of the excellent research that's published within the journal itself. And for all those who are attending, please do send us your best work. And we are trying to work to get quicker decisions than in the past. But no one is here to listen to me talk about the journal. They're all here to listen and learn about some of the great papers. So we're going to go in alphabetical order, approximately 20 minutes for each speaker with a couple of questions after each talk, but I will leave time at the end for more general questions. So with that said, I'm going to turn the, online platform floor over to Ryan Caldwell.
All right, thank you, Steven. So my name is Ryan Cardwell. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. We have a little economics department in the Faculty of Agriculture, so I'm actually an ag economist in the agriculture faculty. And I will put my slides up here. Share. Okay, so I'm assuming everyone can see it. If not, please let me know in the chat or somewhere. So I'm going to talk about a paper that was recently published. The title, What Explains Support for Canada's Supply Management Regime. And this was co-authored with Chad Lawley, my departmental colleague, who's actually just left our department to go into admin, unfortunately. The survey that we used was funded by SSHRC. I'll acknowledge that, and here's the reference for the paper. So I presented versions of this a number of times, and depending on the group, I have to provide either more or less background on this policy called supply management in Canada. So I'll go through it quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but for those of you that are not at all familiar with it, it is a very important, probably the most controversial food and agricultural policy in Canada. It applies to the productions and trade and distribution stages of milk, chicken, turkey, and eggs. And there's three sort of pillars that sort of support the system. One is production quotas. So to participate in the system as a producer, you have to have a license to produce a certain capped amount, and then you can sell to provincial marketing authorities, very strictly regulated. There is cost of production pricing at the farm level. So farmers receive a regulated, administered price, not sort of a market price. And then, of course, holding it all together are very restrictive import controls. So tariff rate quotas, and that keep most, not all, but most foreign competition out of the Canadian market. And then there are interprovincial trade barriers, mostly through the provincial allocation of production quotas. So it's been around for about 50 plus years, and there's sort of stylized accepted facts that are uncontroversial. The farms in Canada that produce these products are smaller than what would be a counterfactual, smaller than in the US, smaller than they would be without this policy. The market incomes going to these farmers is less volatile than other agricultural producers. It's typically much higher as well. and they don't typically qualify for the other kinds of agricultural subsidies that producers receive, agri-stability and things like that. And then, of course, higher wholesale and retail prices for dairy and poultry products that processors face, retailers, and then, of course, consumers. So it's been around a long time, hasn't changed much in 50 plus years. And it is an interesting case study in food and agricultural policy. It's this very old-fashioned supply restricting policy that was once quite common in a lot of our sort of contemporary OECD countries, coupled to production and very trade distorting. There aren't a lot of those around anymore. It's got this cartelized production, and of course, it is a persistent trade irritant. So, particularly at the time of negotiating new agreements or renegotiating existing agreements, it is sort of top of mind at all of our, or most of our trading partners, and it will be with the review of USMCA probably this year. So, given all that, there is strong public support, which I will talk about. And if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about another paper that we're pretty much finished now, looking at the political support. So there's almost unanimous support for the preservation of supply management among political parties. So the motivation for this paper, Chad and I wrote a paper now several years ago in CPP, in which we were estimating the distributional effects on consumers of this policy. And so it's really just Engel's law. We had great, actually this was RDC data as well. And we estimated the incidence of the implicit tax rate from these higher food prices. And of course, it's Engel's law, so it's regressive, and we tried to quantify that. And this paper, for lack of a better description, blew up. It got a lot of attention in the press, and it got a nice prize from the CEA. And my dean was getting phone calls from producer groups, and colleagues were unhappy. And so this just took up so much of our time. And we had months and months and months of conversations. There was a comment on this paper published that was, anyways, I won't go into that. But it became a very big issue in our time. And so we then got very interested in understanding what explains people's support for economic policy. So I'm not going to go through all this literature review. It's in the paper if anyone's interested. But a lot of it was Stephanie Stancheva, who has published many, many articles, some experimental stuff, some descriptive stuff on what is it that really determines and explains people's understanding and support or opposition to economic policies, and really fantastic stuff. And that really motivated what we wanted to do in this paper. So what we're trying to do is investigate people's understanding and preferences for policies, in this case, supply management. How strongly held are these preferences? And do they kind of align with what we would expect? And I'll explain what I mean there. So, our research objectives, we try to understand support and preferences for the policy along a whole bunch of dimensions that we measure in our survey. And then we have an experiment. So how strongly held are these preferences in the face of new information, and then some heterogeneity that I'll talk about. So we did this through a survey, a big online survey that was funded by SSHRC. And we had a referendum question, and we had some randomized, customized treatment that that I'll discuss. So preview results, as we kind of knew, support is quite high among the public, but it's heterogeneous across some dimensions that I'll show you. Information certainly affects support, but the treatment effects, I guess it's very subjective whether you think they're large or small, but they are smaller than we thought they'd be. And they are much smaller than the variation across support among different groups, like preferences for trade, redistribution, things like that. Not much treatment heterogeneity, which surprised us, I'll talk about. And a big story is partisan gap in support for the policy, which I'll explain as well, and which actually did motivated our next paper, which hopefully I can spend a minute or two on. So our data came from an online survey. We hired ECOS to conduct this. We had some restrictions. We stratified to try and make it representative, and then we weighted our data afterwards along the census. So that was our main source of data. So the RDC data was the survey of household spending microdata that we used to create our customized information treatments. Well, I will explain to you in a few minutes. And then the survey was online, which allowed us to do this real-time customization of our information treatments based on the information we were getting from the survey participants at the time, which was kind of an interesting thing to be able to do. It was pretty big. We had almost 5,500 respondents. Not all of them made it through the final sample, but it was a fairly large survey by the standards of this kind of research, especially in Canada. So our survey experiment, it was a fairly large survey, a long questionnaire. We had a lot of questions on preferences for policies up front before saying anything about what this research was about. So there was no explanation or discussion of supply management, but we asked things about preferences for redistribution, trade policy, food preferences, then demographics, some perceptional questions on price effects and incomes. Then we said, okay, we're interested in a policy called supply management. And we gave them sort of a very boilerplate, non-controversial description, kind of like what I put on that front slide, but much more simple. And we asked their perceptions of how you think SM affects food prices. Then each participant was assigned to one of 4 arms in the experiment. The first was just the control group that just received this baseline information. The second group received that baseline plus personalized information about the implicit tax that SM imposes on a household like theirs. So the way we did that was using the survey of household spending. So we use survey of household spending data to estimate parameters in a prediction equation. So the parameters were estimated survey of household spending data, and then the variables into that prediction for each respondent came from their responses in the survey. And so this would happen in the background of the survey in real time. And so we would estimate then this E hat, like this respondent's predicted, it's like a household like theirs. Obviously, there's a big error term here. But for example, a household with 2 adults, 2 kids, and we knew their incomes would get a predicted spending of $1,558 per year, okay, based on survey of household spending data. And so we would then take that $1,558 and we would draw randomly from 10 to 50% a price premium that supply management imposes on these outputs. And I'm not going to go into the range. I can do that later if anyone's interested in where we got these price premiums from. But we had randomization within that price premium as well. So there's sort of 2 elements here of randomization. And then respondents were then told, okay, this is what your household looks like. Data from StatsCan suggests household like yours spend this much. Your grocery budget will go down by this much without the policy. So that was the first information treatment, customized to each respondent. Okay, the second treatment, information treatment, was basically Engel's law, sort of distilling Engel's law. The results from that CPP paper we wrote saying, this is more burdensome for low-income households. It's redistributional in a regressive way. And then the final group got both, combined information treatment. Okay, so after doing that, we had a referendum question on supply management. Given what what we've told you, here's a referendum question on reforming or maintaining supply management. They vote, and we measure their support. Okay, so that's the setup. We had reams of data. There's so much interesting descriptive data in our paper that I'm just going to do a few of them here, but we had all kinds of very interesting things we could ask and learn from this. So these figures, the horizontal axis on all these is mean support among each group. So that this top left-hand figure is by region and voting intention, what is mean support among those respondents. So you can see there's a big partisan gap here, right? The blue squares are conservative and PPC voters. There weren't very many PPC voters in our sample, but support is uniformly lower. Highest in, I think, what is our highest there? Ontario NDP voters were the most supportive of the policy. But across these dimensions, we then asked, well, what do you think would happen to prices? So for people who think supply management is a food price subsidy, support is higher, right? Which is a misperception. And then as that misperception changes, you see a big partisan gap again. Conservative voters, less supportive, much less supportive. Like if you think it's a big price tax or tax on food, its support's very low. Distributional preferences, this was counterintuitive to us. We found that households who are more supportive of progressive redistributional policies are more supportive of supply management, which supply management, of course, does the opposite of that. Of course, people don't understand that. It's a complicated policy. And whether these people think trade should be liberalized, kind of as you would expect, but still a huge partisan gap. That partisan gap just filtered through to everything. So we've got lots of figures like this in the paper on perceptions of income, perceptions of directional price effects that are very interesting. But these are some of the more interesting, relevant ones. So here are our main treatment results. So again, we had 4 treatment arms. Among the control group that just got that basic informational statement, support was high. Say about 69% voted to preserve the system. And so this is very much actually in line with public opinion polls that you might have seen in the press that get picked up in the news, sort of 65 to 70%. So ours was actually pretty close to that. The group that got the personalized cost information, so our treatment effect there was about 6-ish percentage points. So push support down, mean support down to about 63%. The distributional effect information treatment, a little larger, about 7 percentage point decrease in support. And then the combined treatment effect, about 8 percentage points. So what our takeaway from the main treatment effects were, they're intuitive. They're going in the direction we expected they would go. Our priors on these actually were bigger. And, one of the reviewers in our initial submission, we had actually phrased that way, said, they aren't very big treatment effects. And one of the reviewers, actually, that's, for a 5-minute survey, moving support by 7 percentage points. That's actually pretty big. So we reworded it. So took away any subjective description of big or small, but the treatment effects in percentage points are much smaller than the differences we observe in support, say, between conservative and non-conservative voters. That partisan gap is much, much larger than the treatment effect. And the support is high. Even after getting the 2 treatment effects, we're still looking at 61% public support for this policy, so quite high. So, here's a figure from the paper, just looking at some of the estimated coefficients in the full model. And this motivated some of our heterogeneity tests. So things like support for liberalized trade, support for progressive policies. Are there differences in treatment effects between groups that have different opinions on these things? So we did some heterogeneity tests, which I'll show you quickly. So support for trade liberalization. So we knew before saying anything about supply management whether these respondents support liberalizing trade or do not support liberalizing trade. And we can test for heterogeneity of the treatment effects. And the bottom line is, for the distributional information treatment, the effect was a little bit larger and 1 star, but not significantly different from each other. So we cannot reject that they're the same in this case. So no heterogeneity here. And same with the cost information treatment. Even respondents who are more supportive of free trade were not more responsive. They were still responsive, but not any more than those who were opposed to liberalizing trade. And for progressive redistributional policies, this one really did surprise us. This was in our pre-analysis plan because we really expected to find something here. And what we found is that we had a few questions on preferences for redistributional policies. Do you support, changing tax rates and things like this? And people who told us they are strongly supportive of more progressive redistributional policies, the effect was significant and large, but we still cannot reject a larger treatment effect, even for that Engel's law information treatment. It's bigger and it's 3 stars, but we couldn't reject that they're not the same, which was surprising to us. And we had pretty decent power. We had a big sample. That frankly surprised us. It's suggestive, but we can't reject the null. And then perceived price changes. This is the only place where we got even a notion of significance. So this is if people misperceived the directional effect of supply management on prices. So if someone thought supply management kept prices down and they received the cost information that was at least intended to correct that misperception, then we see a little bit of difference in response to that informational treatment. Just not the Engel's Law one, but the personalized cost treatment. So that's intuitive and at least a little bit of significance there. But broadly speaking, we did not see some of the heterogeneity that we thought we would see, particularly with that preference for redistribution. We really thought we would see something there. So that was an interesting result to us. The partisan gap was everywhere. I showed you some of those figures. It was really, really important in understanding our results. So we did this Gelbach decomposition trying to explain the partisan gap. So among the partisan gap, we find that the partisan gap's about 31 percentage points. And this last column, this partisan gap explained, so that shows the share of that 31% that is explained by differences in these preferences. So increased support for low-income households explained a large part of that partisan gap in support for the policy. Misperceptions of the price effect was important. And then we had some questions on what do you think should be a government policy? Should it be reducing debt? Should it be foreign policy? Things like that. We did also test for heterogeneity of treatment effects between conservative and non-conservative voters, which again, we didn't find any, which was surprising to us. Particularly for even among just, for example, NDP voters that at least state a strong preference for progressive redistributional policies, after being told that this policy does the exact opposite, the treatment effects, they were there, but they were not significantly different from other parties, which was very interesting to us. So broadly speaking, what did we find? That support is very heterogeneous across a number of dimensions, most importantly, perceptions of price and voting intention. Information treatment effects were significant. Some heterogeneity, but not really very strong. The perceptions of price effects were really the most significant there. But there's a huge partisan gap. The majority of conservative, either CPC or PPC voters, obviously, vote to dismantle the system. Everybody else votes, or no, I shouldn't say everybody. The majority of other voters, non-conservative, vote to maintain the system, but no heterogeneity in treatment effects. Even in the case where the party's professed platform runs absolutely counter to everything supply management is doing, support's very high, and treatment effects were no different. So, but this really speaks very, very strongly to the success of the lobby groups that these industries employ and maintain. They are very good at this Gordon Rouser line about convincing consumers that price stabilization policies are good for them. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in Ottawa on a stage with the CEO of the Dairy Farmers of Canada, and she's very good at what she does. It was a very convincing talk with data that didn't make sense, but they're very good at making these points, and the interests of these the commercial interests of these concentrated benefits really can prevail. This sort of very old classic political economy story. And so very briefly, I'm just going to take 1 minute if I can to say what we're trying to do with this same survey data is we're trying to understand, I showed that the majority of conservative voters actually would vote to dismantle this. But of course, I'm sure many of you saw that picture of Andrew Scheer drinking out of the milk jug. And, the Conservative Party is fully on board. It's almost like the parties are fighting over each other to show stronger support for this policy. So we also had an experiment where we did a sort of a single issue voting experiment. So are there single issue voters on this policy? And if so, is it significant enough to be a political cost for parties? So we had this experiment where we asked respondents, we have your voting intention. If party X, Y, or Z announces a change, would you change your vote? We asked them again who they'll vote for. Right? It's a very snapshot in time. There's lots of ceteris paribus that we talk about. But the objective was to sort of quantify potential political cost that these parties are thinking about when they are making decisions on this policy. And so, we estimate a model, we get marginal effects, and we then extend these marginal effects and project them into individual voting districts, electoral districts. And we do this simulation to try and quantify political cost. And I don't have time to go into all the ceteris paribus. We got a working paper that's on SSRN if anyone's interested. But we tried to do this, and what we find is the political cost for the Conservative Party is statistically zero. We get some marginal effects, but they're non-significant. Liberal Party, they're big, they're significant, and they're big, right? And so we do this simulation where we simulated an election outcome with these marginal effects and show how many seats might be at risk based on a 2019 voting outcome. And NDP, again, surprisingly, not different from zero. So, the takeaway from this is big potential significant political costs for the Liberals, not for the Conservatives or the NDP. And so we're just kind of finalizing that paper. We're going to hopefully resubmit it in a week or two. So if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to talk about it, or there's a working paper up now. So I think I'm at 22 minutes here. So I can stop there, and happy to take any questions if anyone has some.
So there is a Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom panel. And I know we want to save some time for Barry. Ryan, can you just talk a little bit about what the referendum question was, right? Because there's a whole universe of possible alternative policies to supply management that are not, all the support disappears.
Right. Yeah. So there's even a literature on what dismantlement could look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our survey, we tried to keep it short, but we described a scenario in which farmers who currently own quota would be reimbursed for the value of that lost quota. And then the trade barriers would come down and the production restrictions would disappear. So, we didn't get into issues of, do you provide book value or what, but we did specifically say that the quota value, which is high, like, $4 or $5 million on an average dairy farm, would be reimbursed. And there's various mechanisms through which that could happen that we didn't get into, but we did make sure to say that point. Because of course there's these issues of, loss aversion and, all that kind of quota loss that could be very significant.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So if anything occurs to anybody while Barry's speaking, we usually have a few minutes at the end that Ryan will still be around for. But I will now turn it over to Barry Watson, who's at Acadia University, and he's going to present to us on prices in the North. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Grant. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Everyone can hear me okay? Grant, I'm coming through okay, right?
Yeah, I gave you a big thumbs up.
Excellent. Oh, okay, there we are. And need to move this out of the way. There we are. Okay. And I assume my screen is showing?
It is.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right. So this is a paper that I've done with Nicholas Lee at Toronto Metropolitan University and Angela Daly Angela Daly did the work while at the University of Maine. She is now an independent researcher. And this is part of a series of papers that we're doing that examine the Canadian child benefit transfer along with Nutrition North Canada. So just as a quick summary of the paper, what we're asking in this paper is, are increases in child benefits offset by higher food prices in Northern Canadian communities? The data we're using is the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank from the RDC. We also incorporate some Nutrition North Canada data into this as well, as I'll talk about. In terms of methods, we're using log and level regressions at the community level concerning both prices and per capita income. And then in terms of the event, in terms of a further analysis, we're looking at an event study with specific examination of the CCB in 2016. What do we find? We find that increased child benefit income is associated with higher prices. And this finding persists even when we control for quantity shipped, meaning that we're not just observing a upward sloping supply curve. And this average price effect is particularly driven by communities with a retail monopoly, which again further supports this idea that it's a markup as opposed to just an upward movement along an upward sloping supply curve. In terms of the mechanism, we see that there are increases in retailer markups due to this CCB expansion. In particular, for a family of four, markups offset about 24% of the rise in purchasing power. And this increases quite substantially to about 61% in communities with a retail monopoly. Okay, so this stuff most of you probably know, but I've presented work like this in Europe and they're usually blown away by this. So what is the Canadian North? Well, it's an area delineated by the presence of permafrost. It includes Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, but it also includes portions of Newfoundland, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC above 50 degrees latitude. This is a very vast region. It represents almost 66% of Canada's land mass, but has less than 1% of its population. That statistic always really blows people away when I'm presenting this in other countries. And the population is small, and it's largely comprised of Indigenous peoples of Canada. About 86% of Nunavut, for example, is Indigenous. Canadian average, about 5%. So here's a quick kind of picture of what Canadian North looks like, at least from the perspective of Nutrition North Canada. And so the communities in the Canadian North tend to be isolated. Less than 1% of rail network is located in the territories. There are 120 communities in the Canadian North without year-round access by surface transportation. So therefore, they receive goods by plane or marine service or by temporary ice roads. And more than half of these communities have one grocery store, and the rest typically have two grocery stores. Typically, this is going to be the Northwest Company and then followed by an Inuit co-op. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing that communities observe high prices as a result of transportation infrastructure and presumably lack of retail competition. Angela did a paper with Shelley Phipps and Peter Burton a few years back, finding that relative to the rest of Canada, the cost of living in the territories is 46% higher. So here's an example of some of the prices. For one can of soda down here, you can see it's works out to about $6. So that's pretty intense. So given this high cost of living, the federal government subsidizes shipping of eligible goods to communities without year-round surface transportation, the 120 that I just mentioned. This first began by the Canada Food Mail Program, but it was replaced by Nutrition North Canada in 2011. This program provides higher subsidies for more remote communities, and it provides higher subsidies for more nutritious foods. And these subsidies under the Nutrition North Canada model are paid directly to the retailers. And consequently, the retailers are expected to relay this subsidy onto customers via lower prices. However, there is some work that's shown over the years that the program has definitely benefited retailers, given that there's a lack of subsidy passed through. The NNC has adapted over the years with particular change in 2019 that we're examining right now, but that's beyond the scope of this paper. So again, in terms of the subsidy, at a grocery store, you would typically see something like this, where you see the pre-subsidy price above, which, okay, in the case of red bell peppers is $13.67 per kilogram, pre-subsidy, and then with the subsidy falls to $9.59. So there's this accountability. So in each community, retailers are subject to compliance reviews. They need to report their prices, and in particular, they report their prices on a fixed basket of 67 goods that weigh approximately 52 kilograms. And this is known as the Revised Northern Food Basket, the RNFB. And the RNFB is a basket for a family of four consisting of a nutritious diet. And so the price of this is determined, and it's a weekly determination. And recently in a paper by Galloway and Lee, they find that an extra dollar of subsidy reduces the RNFB by only 67 cents. And there's even less pass-through when there's a monopoly. However, in talking about these lower prices, we can also bring into account the ITK, which is largely consisting of people from Inuit Nunagat, the traditional homeland of the Inuit, that the average household in this area can afford less than 40% of that RNFB. And low-income households can only afford 6 to 13%. And if you look at further studies, the low-income rate in Nunavut is 22.4% compared to the Canadian average, 14.5%. So again, this is actually just raw data. This is not accounting for the fact that the cost of living is much higher in the Canadian North. So if we were to adjust for that, we would expect to see low income rates being even higher in Nunavut. And then in another paper, Tarasuk and Mitchell, I believe Valerie is here during the presentation, finds that 57% of families in Nunavut are food insecure, and that's compared to the Canadian average of 12.7%. And among those with children, this rate actually rises to almost 80%, which is extremely high. And compare that to the Canadian average of 17.3%. So, consequently, the North relies on a lot of government transfers. Galloway and Lee, again, in that same paper, they find that about 25% of household income in Northern Canada came from government transfers in 2015. And Statistics Canada in 2023 reports that the median age of Northern Canadians is 26 years. Compare that to the Canadian average, which is 47 years. And if you look at children in the household, about half these households have at least one child under the age of 18 present in the household, and the Canadian average, again, under 30%. So as you can imagine, child benefits in particular are quite important for these northern communities. So that brings us to two major changes in the child benefit structure during our study period that we're going to examine. In January 2015, there's the introduction of the Universal Child Care Benefit Program. This was a taxable transfer for families with young children. Benefits rose fairly substantially from about $1,200 to almost $2,000 for each child under the age of 6, and $0 to $720 for children ages 6 to 17. A year and a half later, this gets replaced by the Canada Child Benefit Program. The Canada Child Benefit Program also actually consolidated many other programs as well, including the UCCB. And this program sees again another increase in annual benefits for households with children. We're going to argue in this paper this is an exogenous change and examine how this impacts prices in the Canadian North. And one of the things we find with the CCB, one of the things that has been found with the CCB is that it's reduced child poverty fairly substantially by 11% in single mother households and by as much as 17% in two-parent households. So in terms of the data for this study, we're looking at northern communities represented by the RNFB, which is basically those 120 we mentioned. So the data, the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank, is a representative 20% sample of all Canadian tax filers. We use this RDC data with a particular emphasis on market income, child benefits, and other government transfers at the census subdivision level, which we call community level in this study, and we compute this mean value for each. So each community, we have this mean value of market income, child benefits, and other government transfers at the annual level. And then we incorporate some outside data, Nutrition North Canada data concerning the price of the RNFB and the quantity of subsidized food shipped. This is where we're going to look at specifically the impact on prices. And most of this data comes from the Northwest Company. So this is the company that's reporting prices and quantities. This is what the NNC receives. This is what the NNC reports. In the case where there's more than one community, when it's not a monopoly, what happens is they just take the unadjusted average of the prices that they receive. In addition to this data, we also include what would be the average price of the RNFB in Ottawa. So we compute this. Basically, what we're doing here is we're trying to add in a control for a general rise in prices regarding food. Additionally, we want to control for a couple issues concerning potential omitted variable bias. We include average national gas prices, as we suspect that would probably affect freight costs, which would be related on to higher prices. Also, the NNC eligibility. So when the community is eligible to receive Nutrition North Canada subsidies, we also know that's going to affect prices as well. So these are some additional variables we include in the regression. So standard process here, we have a log-log regression concerning prices and income. We're looking at the community level over time. So we're looking at 2011 to 2019. And in this first instance, we're looking at log price regressed on a series of variables, including our log annual income variables. In the second instance, we're looking at the log of quantity shipped, and that's in yearly terms, again, regressed on the log of the income variables and also some other controls as well. However, there's no ex ante argument to prefer this log-log model over a level. And this is something that we discussed quite a bit over our research, is which one to focus on. Since there's no real a priori reason to prefer one over the other, we also chose to estimate a level model using annual mean values. So instead of looking at a log-log, we're now looking at level, and everything's measured in thousands of Canadian dollars. So our results, in the first two columns, we have price. In the second two columns, we have quantity. So the first is the log. The second is the level. If you look at prices, we see, I don't know if my cursor shows up here, but in terms of log of total child benefits, we do see this positive impact on price of like 2.2%. And so this is coming in statistically significant. We also see over here, in terms of the level, average child benefits are also increasing at the level, the annual quantity shipped. So this starts to give us some belief that prices are shifting upward, which could be the result of a markup, but we're not necessarily certain that could be the case. So the results do suggest a standard positive demand shock given an upward sloping supply curve. But northern communities may not be pure price takers in this instance. So prices are not necessarily, in this case, being determined on the global national market, but that's not the only argument you can make here. An upward sloping supply curve may also imply increasing marginal costs, such as decreasing returns to scale. If anticipated demand falls short of actual demand and they have to ship goods up at different times of the year, this could impact economies of scale, for instance, and we could see upward sloping marginal cost. So to further test this hypothesis, we interact our income variables with a retail monopoly indicator variable, and we also control for quantity in the price regressions, such that now we're going to be seeing the impact of these income variables on price independent of quantity. So again, same setup as before. The first and third columns are logs. The third and fourth are with respect to levels. And again, this child benefit variable, when it's interacted with monopoly, shows this rising level of price, both at the log and level level. And so if we look over at the quantity side of things, there's a bit of a puzzle here with respect to that 79. While that's statistically insignificant, one could argue that's not an imprecise zero. There might be something there. And that's kind of a strange finding, because we wouldn't necessarily think output should be rising in this instance, because in a monopoly model, prices go up, but quantity actually falls. So we do discuss that at greater length in the paper. Regardless, if we, again, shift this to an event study and we replace that measure of child benefits with the change in child benefits for each community during that phase 2015 to 2017, where we saw the expansion, We can interact this with the dummy variable for every time period in our study. And then based on this event study model, if our results are being driven by exogenous variation in child benefits, then we would expect no effects in the pre-policy periods, and we would expect some sort of positive effect, particularly concerning prices in the post-period. So our results confirm this conjecture. The issue here again is we have a small sample size, 87 communities that report this data over 8 years. So one of the issues is we're going to get large standard errors, and that's very reflective here. But regardless, if you look at these general trends, you are seeing this upward movement, particularly with respect to prices, but also with respect to quantity as well on the right-hand panel. So in terms of putting this into an actual value, because the parameters are nice and all, but what does this actually mean for the average household, which we argue is important from a policy perspective? If we look at that period, 2015 to 2017, child benefits rose by 70%. And in monopoly communities, they rose by a bit more, by 74%. So if we go back to our parameter estimates with our log-log regression, we plug those in, we can find that the average rise in the log price of the RNFB is 0.012. We do the same thing for monopoly communities. And now we transition to the price of that RNFB per week, which is $413 in 2015. So if we apply that to our increases, we're seeing something about a $5 increase in this cost and for the entire sample and 13 for monopoly communities. So that's weekly. So if we gross this up to annual, we're looking at a $260 increase in the average annual grocery bill for a family of 4. And in monopoly communities, this increases to $676. And again, bringing this back to where these increases are coming from, they're coming, we argue, from these rises in benefits. And so the rise in annual per capita benefits, if we were to look at this from the LAD perspective, we're looking at about a $1,100 increase for the average tax filer, and about 25% of these households receive the CCB. So we're looking at about a $4,400 increase for tax filers receiving child benefits. So for the average tax filer in a family of 4, 24% of the rise in purchasing power from the benefit expansion was offset by RNFB prices. And this actually increases to 61% for monopoly communities. So it's quite large. And this is for at the whole, not specifically looking at families who receive child benefits. So if we zoom in there, we do see that they do benefit because the price rise here, we're looking at 5.9% on average, 15.4% in monopoly communities. But nonetheless, this is a reduction in purchasing power. So this indicates that child benefit expansion imposed, first, a substantial negative externality on non-recipients, higher prices, no change in income, and it offset a large amount of the gain for those who do receive CCB. So to wrap up, as I think I'm pretty much at the 20-minute mark, so that works out. Yeah, we examine cash transfers in Northern Canadian communities. These are communities that are small, remote. Scale economies are important. Entry is rare. Natural monopolies are prevalent. And results in this instance suggest that child benefit expansion had inflationary effects on food prices, especially in communities where retailers had substantial market power. And so what we're finding here, what we argue, and hopefully this paper has convinced you, is that there appears to be a scenario where retailers are capturing some of the transfer through price markups, reducing the purchasing power of non-recipients and offsetting some of the gain among families. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you, Barry. Thanks again, Ryan. If there's any questions from the audience, there's the Q&A panel. You can also raise your hand, which lets me give you permission to speak if you're interested. There's a hand on the panel. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah. Thanks, Barry. I just had a question for you. I'm sure as you are too, I'm kind of following the saga of that Nutrition North pass-through debate. And I know that the JPE paper had that Corgenum because there were some issues in the categorization of monopoly and non-monopoly communities. And so the data has changed, and I think that Lee paper, they had to re-estimate something for the JPub Econ paper. And I know there was this recategorization, and I think, I'm not sure how much it changed things, but I know you probably would have used the categorization prior to that change. And I'm wondering if that has any, because I know you had different results for monopoly and non-monopoly communities.
Good
So I'm
question.
wondering if, I mean, I know this paper's already published, but I'm just wondering if that would change anything, because I think it was pretty significant. Like so many of the communities dropped out. The sample just contracted because
Yes.
some that were categorized as changes didn't, and so it really changed things.
I would have to go back and check with Nick on that in terms of the data that we used for this paper, because that one was published in 2023. And I know Nick's gotten revised data because Nick is the one who's been getting the NNC
I see.
data.
Yeah.
So I would have
Okay.
to check with Nick at the moment, who's actually up north doing some work on our next paper right at the
Oh,
moment.
okay.
But
Yeah,
that
I'm
is a
pretty sure the data used in your paper would have been before that change from Nutrition North. So I just wondered if you know you had different results from monopoly and non-monopoly communities, and that might, I would suspect, be affected by this recoding of
That's a
communities.
great question. I will certainly run that by Nick in terms of the data that we're using there and what impacts that has. I actually wasn't aware that they had to submit an errata for that paper, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a core genome on the Journal Pub Econ, and there's a Canadian Journal of Ag Econ paper following up to Lee and Galloway's paper, and now I think Lee and Galloway have a working paper version in response to the CJE paper, and so it's this ongoing thing. And one of the issues is that data change, but it's not the whole issue. But I know that was important.
Thank you for that.
Right. Maybe I'll just go ahead and thank both speakers. First of all, they're not just excellent papers that were in the CJE, but these are actually very exciting research agendas. So a quick comment and suggestion for both. So I'll start with Ryan. Have you thought at all about, as you're studying this work, thinking about echo chambers and how information could be responsive within, based on the strength of echo chambers for individuals? So how much I follow an echo chamber could affect, let's say, the treatment effect heterogeneity. And then I'm going to jump to Barry. Then for Barry, two quick comments. So I think to help your slide 19 result is that you sort of actually had a direction in mind when you were doing that test on quantity, the level where it was barely significant. So you actually really wanted to do a one-sided test, not a two-sided test. So had you done that one-sided test, I'm pretty sure you're statistically significant because that was what was going through the back of your mind. And then I'm wondering at all with that data. So I know, and this is not an area I work in, with like data on US food stamp style programs that when they changed that or SNAP, they found that individuals bought a lot less healthy food. Have you ever broken down sort of these increases based on what types of foods and how the baskets change? So right now it's a story about price pass-through, but I'm also worried about the health and nutrition consequences. So I don't know who should go first in responses, but I'm just trying to extend you guys' fascinating research agenda in the hopes we'll get more papers.
Well, I'm not totally sure what you're asking about the echo chambers. Like, are you wondering if the treatment effects would be different among people getting information from different sources? Is that?
Yeah, so not just different sources, but the heterogeneity of sources. So would you see treatment effects among people who predominantly focus on single types of sources?
Right.
As a result, it doesn't matter what information you give. So I'm just trying to wonder about malleability. So a lot of the story at the end of the day is this had, as your referee pointed out, a somewhat sizable effect, but it's having a sizable effect on those who are malleable. And there's only so much that we could actually push for. That's what I'm kind of getting at.
Yeah. So I mean, the short answer is no, we haven't thought about doing that. And I doubt we have the data to do it with our original survey. But I'm not quite sure if this is what you're thinking, but certainly I've seen studies that, you know, maybe even some of Stan Chavez stuff, they might ask, for example, what are your primary sources of information? Where do you get your news? That kind of stuff. So there might be something there. I don't know, but we have not even thought about doing that. I mean, we don't have another survey in the works right now based on this. Maybe someday we will, but not currently.
To follow up, that's okay, Ryan. And to follow up on your questions, so in this paper, the RNFB that we're looking at, this is supposed to be nutritious food, right? So the subsidies really focus on nutritional food content, and that's where we're seeing this inflation. However, there's no proof that this is what's necessarily being consumed, right? Because from the annual reports from the Northwest Company, it seems fairly evident that they're aware of these increases in transfers. So now what we're looking at as a first pass, Nick and Angela and I, is the impact this is having on food insecurity. And when we look at something like NNC, this is it's a subsidy, so it becomes this reverse tax, or this virtue subsidy. It's regressive. So if you're very poor, the NNC may not necessarily allow you to still afford this basket or anything from the basket, because presumably if Elon Musk offered us a trip to the moon and he knocked $1,000 off it, we still can't afford it. So the CCB, we argued instead, it has this inflationary side of it, can perhaps really help families who are, say, in the severe position. Again, this is purely, again, through a food insecurity model. So again, in the first one, we're capturing nutrition. In this one, we're capturing food insecurity, which does not necessarily mean nutrition. And we do hope eventually to follow that up in the future with something that's kind of combining both, so that we want to know, are things moving towards, well, one, hopefully the products that they've traditionally consumed in these regions, which hopefully become more affordable and become consumed at a higher rate. And then secondly, of course, like the SNAP programs in the States and everything else, that this is actually translating into something where we're seeing nutritious food being consumed more of.
Thanks. Are there any questions, Grant, in the Q&A panel?
Well, we got nothing. So with that, I think it's fair to call it a day and let everyone get to their next thing. Thanks again, Steven, Barry, and Ryan for joining us today. Obviously, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll look to see future work from all of you. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.